Hi, Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian here. I am delighted to welcome Pasha Dashtgard, who is the director of research for PERIL, who are friends who study all aspects of extremism, violent extremism. Welcome, Pasha. It's so nice to have you.
Thank you so much, Jen. This is a pleasure. Can't wait to unpack the manosphere.
Your research has focused on an area that's got a lot of popular discussion that revolves around the so-called manosphere, toxic masculinity. First of all, how do you define the problem and differentiate it from just people's ordinary views, however biased they may be, however old-fashioned, as we say, they may be, from
Mm.
what is really a problem societally, from a mental health standpoint, from a national security standpoint?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So one of the things is, I'm an academic. This is what I wrote my dissertation on. This is what I've been doing a lot of research on before being the director of research at PERIL. Now, as the director of research, I am paid to do all of this research. And so there are a couple of definitional aspects of this, right? So male supremacy is the ideology that is sort of like what you would believe if the patriarchy were real. So the patriarchy being sort of the gendered system of social relations that elevates some men to positions of power and authority and keeps women from positions of power and authority. And so when we're talking about like what is toxic masculinity, I define that as the policing, harassing, intimidation, and physical violence that is met against boys and men who step outside of the patriarchal social order. So if you're not doing what the ideal patriarchal man is supposed to do, then you're going to be punished in some way, whether that is being mocked, whether that is being ostracized from a social circle, or whether that's being beaten up, harassed, made fun of, threatened, or, having physical violence met upon you.
What is the emotional component? It seems to be motivated by a resentment and anger. Talk to us a little bit about the kind of emotional stew that this comes out of.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, I mean, this is one of the things that's really interesting to me about male supremacy is that it's a low bar of entry into this radicalizing ideology. And so for some men, I'm aggrieved in some way. I've been hurt by a woman. I've been, treated unfairly. And people who are invested in trying to promote male supremacist ideology or recruit people into their hate groups will use these kinds of grievances. So they'll find men who've been, divorced and gotten, have to pay a lot of alimony, or they lost custody of their child, or they've been rejected by, women for their high school and college careers, and they're feeling like, incredibly resentful of this. So there's like pre-factor vulnerabilities. There's stuff like lack of a strong social network. Trauma is a big pre-factor for this kind of thing. Loneliness. And then when you have these very normal experiences, being rejected, struggling with talking to the opposite sex, getting a date, dating the person that you've had a big crush on for years. When something like that happens, and then you're given this lens through which to interpret that experience, and that lens is incredibly toxic and like full of anger and hostility, and what you're being told is that this woman rejecting you is actually part of a broader conspiracy to keep men like you from being happy, keep men from like you from having families and children and promoting, this Western culture. So there's this sort of interaction where a person who has these kinds of vulnerabilities already comes into contact with this very toxic ideology, and they come out on the other side thinking like, oh, this wasn't just like this young woman got busy and she didn't want to go out on a date with me, or I'm not her type and she just didn't feel like, going on a second date. It's like, no, they're being told that this is part of a global conspiracy to destroy Western culture and that they are a victim of this broader sort of plan to undermine men and to destroy masculinity. And so it really plays into this conspiratorial thinking.
When does it cross the line, and how does it cross the line between certain traditional gender views? Women should remain in the home, or women should not be entitled to an abortion. When does that cross from that into a syndrome of toxic, dangerous masculinity? What's the dividing line, and how do you go from one to the other?
That's a really good question. So first thing I would say is I want to make there are some important ways in which this is not at all traditional. A lot of the preconceptions and sort of like preoccupations that the manosphere is entertaining have nothing to do with the sort of traditional leave it to beaver, head of the household, father husband role. It's in fact a lot of parts of the manosphere reject that completely. They say that marriage is a trap. Women are just trying to trick you into paying for their bills or whatever, whatever, whatever. So there's some ways in which this stuff really does borrow from the sort of long history of patriarchal nonsense, but there are some ways in which this stuff is very new and very different and very like, that's sort of one of the things that was really interesting to me was like, how is the incel ideology very different from like sort of traditional masculinity? So having said that, what is the dividing line? I think you're asking a really complicated question. It's because it's like radicalization is a process and it's not a linear process. For a long time, the models that we use to sort of define and understand radicalization was like a staircase model where it was like, first this happens and then this happens and, you're sort of building your way up. What we've realized now is that radicalization is a really dynamic, fluid process. And it's not linear. It's not something that goes, progressively, slowly. Sometimes it goes from 0 to 60. Sometimes it's like these factors are sort of stacking on top of each other and then some sort of like inciting event happens. Having said all that, what is that dividing line? There are a couple of things that I think really distinguish, like, you have bad opinions from you're a male supremacist and you are fully like radicalized into this ideology. One thing I think, if you want to use, so I should have said before, Jen, my background as a mental health counselor. So I was a therapist for many years. And so in therapy, this is a big question as well, is like, what is the definition of abnormal psychology? What is the definition of abnormal behavior? And in that context, we talk a lot about, can you work and can you love, right? Those are the kind of like, how do I know that my uncle is, deeply mentally ill versus just like a little quirky? And it's like, can he hold a job? Can he have a partner? Can he like have a loving relationships? And can he like hold a work responsibility? It's kind of an old standard, to be real. But in
Love and work. It's good for Freud. It's good for us,
Jen, I wasn't going to mention Freud. Good job. You nailed it. That is exactly who defined this. But yes, so with radicalization, I would say that to me, the same idea of a disruption in your ability to build a meaningful social relationship as a result of adherence to this ideology. So you think about what it means to be a male supremacist, what it means to be a young man who really is deeply invested in this kind of ideology. How are you ever going to build a meaningful relationship with a woman in your life? How are you ever going to have strong connections with men if you believe that you're always in zero-sum conflict with every man that you're in a room with? How can you like, has your adoption of this lingo and this jargon and this rhetoric reached a point where it has seeped into normal day-to-day interactions with friends and family and strangers? Has it changed the way that you approach normal interactions where like, we see this. I was just reading the other day that like elementary school and middle school teachers who are female are running into young men who aren't willing to listen to them in the classroom. That's a problem, right? Like if you hit a level where you're like, I don't even want to engage with female authority figures, we have problems, right? I spoke with with a family who had a son who was college age, and this guy was planning on dropping out of college to pursue a cam girl business because that's what he read about through Andrew Tate's website. Like that, where and so as a result, they found out about this because he had like fake passports that he was like developing in order to sort of get this business started. Like that is a telltale sign when you start engaging in illegal activity, when this ideology has disrupted your ability to make meaningful relationships. I think those are pretty significant. When you start calling for violence against your political or social enemies, in some cases this is women, in other cases it's men who are, have betrayed the man code, or blue pill men, or betas, or whatever the jargon is. um when you start calling for violence, when you start sort of, in my mind, you've adopted this worldview where it has like distorted how you understand yourself and others. That to me is where what real radicalization means. But I will say this is a gray area and not,
Yeah,
there's no one answer.
absolutely. The phenomenon that you're describing seems to be growing, and it's worked its way into the political jargon, into politics, and the rest. Is that because there are forces in society that are contributing the sense that they're under siege, that they're victims, that they are resentful? Is it because of the internet and the ability to spread these ideas? Why do we see more of it now than we did 10 or 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things going on. One is that it's the communities are growing, and they are, because of social media and because of the nature of our sort of digital milieu, the networks are able to be more in contact with each other. You think about pre-internet, how would these guys have even come into contact with each other? It would have been like one guy met another guy. Oh my gosh, you also believe all of these things? Now you can find people who believe anything. And you can find a community of, I don't know, 250, 2,500, 25,000 people who think that there's lizard people, that the earth is flat, that birds aren't real. Like you can find any kind of conspiracy theory and like a community of people who will reinforce this ideology. So part of it is this. It's that we have, the internet facilitates echo chambers and these kind of what I call soapbox communities. So you think about standing on a soapbox ranting. This is so much of what the manosphere is like a man writing a post that's like, let me tell you how dating goes. Let me tell you about women. And it's like, this is very seductive for men, in particular, who feel disempowered, who feel marginalized, who feel ignored. This is a way that they can get that kind of validation. And so it is appealing to a group of, like a large group of men. The second part of this is, everybody has talked about the loneliness epidemic. I don't need to talk about the loneliness epidemic as well, but you think about how that loneliness epidemic interacts with a, a built-in community that is paradoxically, well, is non-judgmental of you so long as you buy into the ideology. As soon as you buy into the ideology, you're part of us. And part of what is so seductive about these manosphere groups is that they're attracting men who feel rejected and marginalized from other parts of the society. And what is really happening, what is the sort of persuasive secret sauce here, is these men are struggling. These men are in pain. And what they're hearing from these male supremacist influencers, this is like Andrew Tate's sort of like, this is his game plan, is he starts all of his podcasts with men are suffering and I'm the only one talking about it, right? It's an invitation in. And so what often happens is that these guys come looking for community, they come looking for acceptance, they come looking for validation of their pain. Hey, I'm a virgin and it sucks. I hate it. I feel horrible about myself. I don't want to be told that it's going to be okay. I don't want to be told that it's not a big deal. Actually, what I want is to be part of a giant pity party where we all get together, we all talk about how awful it is to be incels, to be virgins, and then we get to also talk about whose fault it is. And doesn't that make us feel so good that we can all agree that it's women's fault, it's feminists' fault, it's the Jews' fault? Like, these are the enemies that are causing us all our pain. And so there's this the reason that we're seeing it grow in part is because they're pretty sophisticated in how they are appealing to young men. And then layered on top of all of that is the current administration amplifying all of that rhetoric, bringing it all up into the mainstream and legitimizing it and making it a part of the mainstream discourse in a way that it doesn't, it's not like it's additive, but it's validating. And when you bring, it's like shifting the Overton window on what is an acceptable kind of like narrative around why men are suffering. They've shifted it all the way over to including women having the audacity to have bodily autonomy and like choosing not to have sex with men that they don't like or are attracted to. Like, that's the level that we are able to now criticize women for. Yeah.
The language is such a tell. When the president says wants to criticize a woman, he doesn't say her ideas are wrong. He says she's nasty, as if that is a violation of the domestic docile profile he's entitled to have. She's nasty. And I think that's such a tell in this mindset. So, as we always do, we want to know what can be done about this. That it's destructive for these individuals. They engage in antisocial behavior. You see it infecting a younger generation of people. What's the solution? What do you do?
So yeah, so one thing is, oh, we have guides for this. We have resources. We do have tools. There, you're not alone in this fight. We at PERIL probably get 2 emails a week from a parent, a principal, a teacher who's just beside themselves. They found a group chat that is horrifying. They found text messages. They were talking to their son or their daughter, and some talking point came up that was just, deeply offensive, and they don't know what to do. So I'm here to tell you, there are things that you can do. The PERIL, in collaboration with the Southern Poverty Law Center, wrote a guide called Not Just a Joke, Preventing Sexuality and Gender-Based Bigotry. It's an awesome guide. It is for anybody who is a trusted adult in the life of a young person who is trying to figure out how to have this conversation. So, and there are other resources as well. There's a Western State Center has a guide on how parents and caregivers can talk to their children about conspiracy theories, which I also really like. PERIL has the parent and caregiver guide, and then the whole of community guide. All of these things are offering both knowledge and strategies. So the knowledge part, you should have some idea of what websites, platforms, sites, forums, and apps are a problem. So if your kid is on, Parler or Gab, you might want to be asking some questions, right? I was going to say 4chan, but 4chan has been taken down. Hey. But then the other part of this is the skills. What do I actually do? What do I actually say? How do I approach this situation? So this is tricky. There's not one magic word or phrase that's going to unlock or solve all these problems. But what I tell people when they ask is this: First of all, this is not going to be the only conversation you're going to have. This isn't Plato's Republic. People don't just go, oh, Socrates, I didn't think about that before. No, you're going to have multiple conversations with them. So, with that in mind, you cannot come from a place of anger and shutting them down and guilting them and shaming them for these beliefs. That's not going to work. That doesn't actually persuade anybody. In fact, what that does is it just pushes people further to their own ideological positions. What instead you want to do is you think about this. I almost approach it the way that I was a substance abuse counselor for a while, and the way that substance abuse counselors approach drugs and alcohol, where it's like, it's not actually about the drug. It's about the pain that you're self-medicating using the drug or the alcohol, right? So what you should be asking this young man or woman in your life who is like falling down the rabbit hole is like, what appeals to you about this? What is interesting to you about this? What are you worried about that this is speaking to? So you love Andrew Tate because of how he talks about women. Are you worried about women? Are you worried about dating? What's your experience of dating and relationships? How are you feeling deeply insecure? Like, let's talk about that. We don't need to talk about the 80-20 rule. We don't need to talk about hypergamy. Like, it is annoying because these things are fake pseudoscience, and they are building arguments based off of nonsense, based off of like things that are just objectively not true. But you're going to get bogged down in debating facts and going like, once you hit Google Scholar, the debate is over. Like, don't do it. Just you've all failed. Instead, it's really about hitting on the emotional level. So one of the things that PERIL's been doing, we developed these videos, these attitudinal inoculation videos, where we give people a little dose of propaganda and we explain to them how this propaganda works. What is the mechanism by which they are trying to persuade you? And when you do that, what we find is that people, when they encounter new propaganda, are much less likely to endorse those ideas. So this is a thing where you're going to have a conversation about media literacy. You're going to have a conversation about digital literacy. You're going to have a conversation about who are influencers and what is their stake in any of this. You know, I remember having to have this conversation amongst my friends as a young man around like Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh and these people who are like it took a while for me to be like, oh, they don't care about what they're saying. They're just trying to make money. Like Andrew Tate, if he could make money being liberal, he would. It's like, this is profitable and people listen to him because he says horrifying things. And now he's got respect and now he's got clout and blah, 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 blah. But like trying to explain to the young person in your life that like
demystifying it and giving them a sense that they're being manipulated. Last question for you as we reach the end of our time. Can this be scaled up? In other words, even when you don't have a specific individual who is exhibiting these issues, can we, from a societal point of view, from a social mental health point of view, be doing things in schools and communities, in religious organizations that prevent or intercede at a very low level before they get super radicalized?
absolutely. I mean, that's the PERIL approach. That's the way that we see this, is that rather than focusing on crisis management, you know, how do you disarm a mass shooter who entered your synagogue? How do you, you know, organize your school so that there's only one entry point in or out? It's like, if we're there, if that's where our focus is, then we're done. We have already lost the battle. Like, we need to be talking to parents about how they can build resilience in their children against this kind of ideology. So yes, absolutely. Prevention is scalable. Like tertiary responses, de-radicalization, that's not scalable. De-radicalization takes years of therapy. It's like the person has to really want to do it. The therapist has to be invested for years in this client's success. That's not how that works. The way it works is exactly what you're talking about, building community resilience to radicalization. So what does that mean? That means having school and after school and faith communities that include a bunch of people, where young people feel connected to something bigger than them, where they feel like I have a strong social network where I can talk about problems to multiple people in my life. I have real, deep, meaningful relationships. I think about social media is like to use like an SAT analogy. It's like social media is to community as junk food is to real food, where it's like you're consuming social media and you have almost the feeling of being in a community, of having friends, of being connected to other people, but it's not quite there. There's something a little artificial about it, and there's something that's not really nourishing about it. And so, how do you build a school community where there's not bullying, where there's not harassment, where if a young man shares nudes of his girlfriend with his friends, that there are real consequences, and that the school community comes together and says like, hey, we're not doing this. This is not acceptable to us. How do you promote bystander interventions where young men feel like, hey, I wasn't the one generating nudes of my classmates using an AI undressing app, but I was friends with a guy who was. And rather than saying nothing, I should have said something. It's like these are the ways that you promote this. And then we have to have a very real conversation with our young people. And listen, I say young people because that's easier to prevent, but this is a problem with older men as well. We have to have a conversation about like, what is the media we're consuming, and what are the messages in those media, and how are they promoting a kind of ideology that is really dehumanizing to half of our population.
That is fascinating. And I think what people are probably thinking about, I'm certainly thinking about in the work that PERIL does, is the same themes, whether it's misogyny, racism, or, any kind of radicalization. It comes back to this same fundamental problem of building healthy, resilient people who are able to debunk what's incoming and to intervene earlier rather than later. So it's very helpful. I think this is why we have the PERIL people on, because these are the issues of our time. And if we don't start at a lower level, we wind up running around as we are now, trying to do a whack-a-mole to keep people from engaging in very dangerous, very violent behavior. So thank you, Pasha. He comes to us from the Netherlands today, so it's late in his day. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will look forward to the next installment from PERIL. So thanks very much.
Can't wait. Bye, Jen.
Bye.